Greetings, esteemed viewers. Today we will delve into one of the darkest and simultaneously most captivating pages of ancient history. We will journey to Rome in the first century of our era to examine the life and reign of an emperor whose name became synonymous with cruelty, madness, and tyranny. We will speak of Nero, a figure who has provoked controversy and horror for nearly 2 millennia. His reign is a kaleidoscope of brilliance and baseness, refined art and monstrous crimes, high ambitions and the deepest moral decline. Let us together try to understand who this man was, what forces shaped his personality, how he ascended to the pinnacle of power in the most powerful empire in the world, and why his rule left such a deep and bloody mark on the memory of humanity, becoming a warning for all subsequent eras. All villainies, strangely enough, possess a certain depressing similarity, as if following the same grim scenario, and villains of the past, at least those who left their mark on Roman history, are often frighteningly similar to each other in their motives and methods. Villainous acts, be it betrayal, murder, or tyranny, are somehow monotonous in their essence. Feelings of malice, vindictiveness, paralyzing fear are by no means new. They repeat themselves century after century, whereas truly great bright deeds, acts of high morality dictated by self-sacrifice or genius, are always colored by the bright, unique individuality of their performer. The story of Nero, the villain emperor, the infamously matricidal, could without exaggeration be titled Nero, A Life in Eternal Fear, or even what would be even more accurate, A Life in Unceasing Terror. For villainy and fear are inseparable companions. They are like sinister twin brothers, always walking hand in hand through the darkness of the human soul and historical cataclysms. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, such was his full name after ascending the throne, was, to be precise in the sequence of rulers, the 5th or 6th emperor in the history of Rome. This slight variability in numbering arises from which figure is considered the starting point of imperial power. If we count from Gaius Julius Caesar, who, strictly speaking, was not an emperor in the sense of his successors, but who, with his dictatorship and reforms, effectively laid the unshakable foundations for the transition from a crumbling republic to a monarchical empire, then Nero would be the 6th ruler. If, however, we begin counting from Octavian Augustus, the first official princeps and de facto founder of the Roman Empire, then Nero would be the 5th. Octavian Augustus himself, an iconic, complex, and multifaceted figure, a master of political mimicry, hypocritically but very far-sightedly, called himself only princeps, which literally translates as first among equal senators. By this he sought to emphasize his formal respect for ancient senatorial traditions and republican institutions, although in reality he concentrated enormous, practically unlimited power in his hands. He did not consider himself fully an emperor in the Eastern despotic sense, but only the first citizen of the state, thereby trying to maintain the appearance, the facade of republican rule, which was extremely important for pacifying Roman society. After decades of civil wars, after Augustus's long and generally successful reign, his stepson Tiberius ascended the throne, a gloomy, suspicious figure who distanced himself from Rome in his later years, whose reign was marked by an increase in political trials for insulting majesty and a wave of repression against the senatorial nobility. He was followed by Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, which means little boot. His name became a byword for a mad, unpredictable, and cruel despot who, according to not always impartial ancient historians like Suetonius, was firmly intent on making his favorite horse Incitatus a consul and even a priest. This was some kind of demonstrative, defiant debauchery, a mockery of all foundations, something completely beyond not only human norms, but also elementary notions of common sense and decency. Nero's predecessor on the imperial throne was Claudius, his great-uncle and stepfather, perhaps the quietest, most unwarlike, and most learned of the early Roman emperors. Claudius sincerely loved and deeply knew history, philology, the Etruscan language, himself wrote scholarly works, and, by and large, did not at all aspire to imperial power, preferring solitary scholarly pursuits. His path to the purple was rather tragicomic and accidental. After Caligula's brutal murder by the Praetorians, the enraged and disoriented guard, searching for a new emperor, accidentally found him, a 50-year-old scholar, in the palace where he was hiding in terror behind a curtain or, according to another version, under a bed. The soldiers dragged him out from there and, to his own immense surprise and fear, immediately proclaimed him emperor. Claudius was the brother of the famous and universally beloved General Germanicus, extraordinarily popular in Rome and in the army for his military successes and personal qualities. Germanicus died suddenly in the East at a young age, and many in Rome, including his widow Agrippina the Elder, suspected that he had been secretly poisoned, possibly by a tacit order from the envious and suspicious Emperor Tiberius, who feared his growing fame and influence. Claudius himself, despite his outward learning and relative gentleness of temper, in the end was also, according to widespread and very plausible opinion, villainously poisoned by his last, fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, Nero's ambitious and ruthless mother. It was in such an oppressive atmosphere of constant intrigues, palace conspiracies, underlying fear and open violence that the first Roman emperors of the Julio-Claudian dynasty ruled. Among these early emperors, perhaps only Octavian Augustus remained in historical memory as a brilliant statesman, a wise ruler, although he too, especially during the turbulent period of his youth and struggle for power, engaged in rather unsavory and even cruel deeds, for example, participation in the proscriptions after Caesar's death. He was an experienced warrior, a talented and successful military commander, and he managed to break through to sole power after terrible, bloody, and devastating civil wars that had plagued the Roman Republic for almost a century. He successively defeated all his powerful rivals, Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, the ambitious Mark Antony, and the last of Gnaeus Pompey, the great sons. Such incredible, almost supernatural luck was highly valued in Rome. It was considered a clear sign of divine favor, felicitas, bestowed by the gods. But above all, Roman society, exhausted by decades of chaos and internecine strife, valued the long-awaited civil peace, Pax Romana, which Augustus managed to establish and maintain throughout his long reign. This peace became a solid foundation for the subsequent flourishing of the Roman Empire, its economy, culture, and law. Such was the appearance of the nascent Roman Empire, and it is precisely from this moment that it begins its count as a stable political system. And so, among its first emperors after Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, the figure of Nero appears on the historical stage. An emperor-actor, a man who, according to contemporary accounts, adored all forms of art, music, poetry, theater, painting, sculpture, and himself passionately desired to act, to perform on the public stage, to sing, to declaim, eliciting applause and the raptures of the crowd. But before speaking in detail about his controversial artistic ambitions and their consequences, it is worth telling in more detail about his early life, his ascent to power, the forces that shaped him, and how this life was invariably accompanied by a deep, all-pervading horror. It was the year 54 of our era, the middle of the 1st century, an epoch when the Roman Empire reached the peak of its power. Young Nero, who at the time of Claudius's death had barely reached 17, becomes not just a princeps, formally first among equals, as Augustus once preferred to call himself, but an absolute all-powerful emperor, ruler of a vast state. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, a woman of incredible willpower, unbridled ambition, and extreme cruelty, who stopped at nothing to achieve her goals, led him to this dizzying pinnacle of power with a firm, calculating, and ruthless hand. And this boy, essentially still a teenager with no real life or political experience, is proclaimed emperor of an immense world empire, stretching from the misty shores of Britain in the north to the scorching sands of Egypt and Nubia in the south. from the Atlantic coast of Spain and Gaul in the west to the borders of the mighty Parthian Empire in the east. In the very heart of this gigantic empire, in the eternal city of Rome, by the time of Nero's accession, an extremely contradictory, tense, and explosive political and social situation had developed. On the one hand, ancient republican ideals of civil liberty, valor, the rule of law, and the Senate, had formally not been abolished by anyone, and they had not been forgotten. They were still talked about, debated, remembered with poorly concealed nostalgia, especially in educated circles. And most of all, albeit in whispers, the senators, representatives of ancient aristocratic families, those who previously, during the glorious republic, had concentrated supreme legislative and executive power, spoke about this. Now, however, with the appearance of the omnipotent, sacralized figure of the emperor, they found themselves effectively relegated to secondary or even decorative roles, deprived of real influence on state affairs. Which of the proud descendants of Brutus, Cato, or Scipio could like such a humiliating state of affairs? Furthermore, the horrors of the recent past were still fresh in memory. The terrible period of Lucius Cornelius Sulla's dictatorship at the beginning of the 1st century BCE, a time of most cruel persecutions of political opponents, mass executions, without trial or investigation, confiscations of property, a sea of innocent bloodshed, devastating civil wars following one after another. Particularly terrible and demoralizing were the proscriptions, officially published lists of persons declared outlaws for whose heads a generous reward was offered. This inevitably generated a wave of denunciations, betrayals, mutual suspicion, creating an atmosphere of universal distrust and sticky fear in society. Some credit was given to young Nero at the very beginning of his reign for the fact that, although he did not completely abolish the shameful practice of paying for denunciations, he nevertheless significantly reduced its size by a quarter, which was perceived by many as a good sign of a coming softening of morals and the advent of more humane times. However, despite these first positive steps, the general atmosphere in Rome still remained quite gloomy and tense. The senators, on the one hand, secretly hated imperial power, did not want to obey emperors, many of whom were upstarts or tyrants, and secretly wished to regain their former omnipotence and prestige. But on the other hand, they were terrified of the emperors, their anger, their praetorian guard, their spies and informers, and they were so afraid that very quickly, especially under Caligula and Claudius, many of them turned into outright flatterers, sycophants, and lackeys, which was completely inconsistent with the former greatness, independence, and pride of Roman senators, descendants of those legendary men who once built and defended the great Roman Republic. For example, an indicative episode is when young Nero, having just ascended the throne, delivered his first official throne speech before the Senate. It is assumed, and quite reasonably, that the text of this speech was composed for him by his chief mentor, the famous Stoic philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca, a master of eloquence. So the senators, having heard this speech, expressed such boisterous, obsequious delight that immediately, without any discussion, they proposed to declare the 17-year-old youth Pater Patriae, father of the fatherland, the highest honorary title which was usually awarded for exceptional services to the state, and this to a youth who had done nothing yet for Rome. What an incredible, dizzying temptation of crude and undisguised flattery for an unformed soul. Nero, to his credit, at that moment, had enough sense, tact, or perhaps the influence of his wiser advisors, Seneca and Burrus, to refuse such a premature and undeserved title. Indeed, the speech itself, written by Seneca, was undoubtedly beautiful in form and content, full of lofty promises of justice, mercy, respect for the Senate and laws. And Nero, possessing natural artistry and a good voice, delivered it like a true inspired actor, captivatingly, emotionally, making a strong impression on the audience. The speech contained many promises that he, Nero, would take upon himself only command of the army and administration of the provinces where legions were stationed, but would in no way limit the powers and dignity of the Senate, and would show sincere mercy and indulgence to all senators, even those who had been in opposition to his predecessor. "Down with violence, down with all bad memories of the past," he exclaimed pathetically with well-rehearsed feeling, eliciting boisterous and prolonged ovations. The grateful listeners, literally stunned by his eloquence and generous promises, immediately proposed that this wonderful speech be inscribed in golden letters on a silver column, installed in the Senate building, and solemnly reread annually at a meeting. They, from the very beginning of his reign, either out of a sense of deeply ingrained fear of new, unknown power or because of an already habitual, almost reflexive flattery, effectively prostrated themselves before him, voluntarily signing their complete inability and even unwillingness to really influence state policy, readily surrendering all power and initiative into the hands of the young, inexperienced emperor and his closest advisors. Under Nero's predecessors, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius, for almost 60 years, Roman senators were systematically persecuted. They were executed on fabricated charges, sent into indefinite exile to deserted islands where they often died of hardship, their property was confiscated, they were starved to death in dark prison dungeons. The senators remembered all this perfectly well, and this genetic fear, passed down from generation to generation, had deeply ingrained itself in their souls, paralyzing their will to resist. And besides, they knew very well who his mother, Agrippina the Younger, was. This woman stood in the political life of Rome at that time as a sinister, frightening shadow. She possessed colossal authority and influence, being not just the emperor's mother, but also the daughter of the universally beloved hero Germanicus, granddaughter of the divine Augustus himself, through his daughter Julia the Elder, and consequently great-granddaughter of the divine Julius Caesar. This gave her an almost sacred status in the eyes of many. By cunning, intrigue, and possibly crime, she managed to marry her elderly uncle, Emperor Claudius, after he was widowed. His previous wife, the young and notoriously dissolute Valeria Messalina, had been executed by Claudius's order for participating in a conspiracy and public adultery. Having become empress, Agrippina immediately and purposefully began to act, striving to ensure that her son Nero, born from her first marriage to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, would become the heir to the aging and ailing Emperor Claudius. She acted to the detriment of the legitimate heir, Claudius's own son by Messalina, young Britannicus, who was several years younger than Nero. Having achieved Nero's adoption by Claudius and the granting of equal rights with Britannicus, Agrippina, according to widespread and practically unquestioned historical opinion, eliminated her husband emperor by poisoning him. It seems these were skillfully prepared white mushrooms, which Claudius loved very much and which, as is known, are easily confused with poisonous ones or can have poison added to them. Much later, already having become an absolute tyrant and having lost all remnants of moral bearings, Nero, as Suetonius relates, cynically joked about this, repeating the words of an unknown wit, "Truly, mushrooms are the food of the gods for thanks." To mushrooms, Claudius became a god. The fact is that immediately after the death of a Roman emperor, if he had not been overthrown and cursed by the Senate, he was usually proclaimed a god, performing the so-called apotheosis, and was included in the state pantheon. Agrippina the Younger, a woman of iron will and boundless ambition, resolutely wanted to rule in place of her young and inexperienced son, or at least alongside him, holding all the reins of empire management in her hands. And she did not even try to hide it, acting with audacity unheard of for a Roman woman. She behaved politically defiantly and completely originally. She appeared volatile invited at Senate meetings, where women, according to centuries-old traditions, were strictly forbidden entry. She demonstratively sat next to her son emperor at official receptions and state ceremonies, sometimes even on the same throne or on a dais behind him, showing by her imperious demeanor to senators, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors that she was, perhaps even more important than the young emperor himself. In some eastern Hellenized provinces of the empire, where traditions of venerating royal women were strong, coins even began to be minted with two profiles, Nero's and Agrippina's, placed side by side or prohetos other. This was done just in case to please the powerful and formidable empress mother whose influence seemed boundless. However, very soon, this unceremonious interference in all affairs, this constant and humiliating control for a young man on the part of his mother, began to terribly irritate young Nero, who aspired to independence, pleasures, and complete, unrestricted power. Perhaps it was from this growing, dull, terrible irritation which the imperious, despotic, and all-pervading figure of his mother, Viclicula in him, that his gradual but inexorable moral degradation began. For he was probably not from childhood a complete pathological beast as some later authors paint him. How did his contemporaries describe him in his youth when he had just ascended the throne? Outwardly, he was quite attractive. He had a thick reddish beard, which he later grew in the fashion of philosophers, rather beautiful, though somewhat bulging blue eyes. It is reported that he was somewhat nearsighted and therefore, in the theater or at gladiatorial games, to better see what was happening in the arena, he used a specially cut, concave emerald crystal as a kind of magnifying glass or light filter to protect his eyes from the bright sun. True, even then, some observers noted in him a certain carelessness and untidiness in dress and appearance. He could be unkempt and sometimes appeared in public in a simple house robe or tunic without the proper imperial insignia, which shocked adherents of strict Roman traditions and etiquette. Enemies, of course, did not miss the opportunity to add other, more unpleasant details, saying, for example, that his body was covered with unsightly spots or pimples, and that an unpleasant odor emanated from him, although this could have been malicious gossip. In his ambitious dreams, young Nero saw himself equal to the great Alexander the Great, envied his unfading military glory and the scale of his conquests. At the same time, he apparently also envied the moral authority of Octavian Augustus, who went down in history not only as the founder of the empire, but also as a generous patron of arts and literature, a friend of Virgil and Horace. That is, something human, some high ambitions, a desire for fame, and not just a bad one, was undoubtedly present in him at an early stage. But Agrippina's despotic behavior, constantly interfering not only in state affairs but also in his personal life, in his love affairs, as well as the contradictory influence of his two chief advisors in the early years of his reign, the stern and straightforward Praetorian prefect Afranius Burrus, an experienced military commander, a native of the provincial Gallic nobility, and not from freedmen, as some authors mistakenly indicate. Freedmen indeed were often dangerous and craved power, but Burrus was of different origin, and the cunning, constantly lecturing, though undoubtedly wise philosopher Seneca, his tutor. All these complex and contradictory influences greatly disfigured his initially unstable and impressionable character. As a result of these complex psychological and political interactions, accumulated grievances, growing megalomania, and thirst for absolute power, Nero eventually decided on a monstrous crime. He became a matricide, committing one of the most terrible and condemned acts known not only in Roman but in all world history. The murder of his own mother, Agrippina the Younger, was a terrible, carefully planned but several times failing, true tragic drama played out in several acts in the spring of 59 of our era. First, Nero, on the treacherous advice of his freedman Anicetus, Nero's former tutor, now commanding the Misenum fleet and hating Agrippina, arranged for the specially sawn ceiling in her chambers at a villa near the Bay of Baiae to collapse over his mother. The calculation was that it would look like an accident. The ceiling did indeed collapse, but Agrippina, by some happy chance for her, was not under the collapsed part at that moment or managed to get out from under the rubble unharmed. Then, not abandoning his plan, Nero invited his mother to a reconciliatory feast at Baiae, and after it, offered her to return to her villa not by land but by sea, on a luxurious ship specially built for this purpose. This ship, however, was deliberately constructed so that it could easily fall apart in the open sea at the press of a secret mechanism, or holes were made in its hull that were supposed to open. The boat did indeed begin to sink when it moved away from the shore, but Agrippina, to the great surprise and disappointment of the conspirators, saved herself again. She, it turns out, had been an excellent swimmer since youth and managed to reach the shore, or was picked up by fishing boats. Then, already desperate and enraged by failure, Nero, fearing that his mother would expose his plans, began to feverishly consider other ways to eliminate her. He turned for help to the already mentioned infamous poisoner named Locusta, a true professional in her grim craft, whose services, according to widespread rumors, Agrippina herself had used to eliminate persons amicu bucquae, including possibly Emperor Claudius. But this too proved useless. Agrippina, herself having rich experience in palace intrigues and probably knowing a thing or two about poisons, was extremely suspicious and, as they say, regularly took various preventive antidotes, fearing an assassination attempt by her son or his entourage. And then, seeing no other way out and incited by Anicetus and other enemies of Agrippina, Nero resorted to open violence. He had to act as was done in the times of the bloody proscriptions of the dictator Sulla or during civil wars. Simply send a detachment of armed soldiers to her villa, led by the same Anicetus and several centurions, to kill her without any formalities. The scene of this murder, as described in detail and with drama by the great Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus in his Annals, was truly horrible. When the murderers, led by Anicetus, burst into her bedroom, Agrippina, at first not believing what was happening, tried to appeal to their remaining conscience or fear of imperial wrath if they were acting tregs. She, according to one version, shouted, "Do not dare to touch me, I am the mother of your emperor. If you have come from him, tell him that I am well." But then, seeing the bared swords and realizing that it was all over and it was her own son's order, she, according to Tacitus, showed amazing courage. She pointed to her belly and said to the centurion who raised his sword over her, "Strike here, ventrem feri, this womb that bore such a monster." In this last gesture and words there is undoubtedly something tragically theatrical, a kind of grim irony of fate, characteristic, however, also of her actor son. If we are already talking about Nero's parents and their influence on his formation, then we cannot fail to recall his biological father. Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, belonging to one of the oldest and noblest but infamously cruel and arrogant plebeian families of Rome, was known even in the extremely dissolute and cruel Roman society for his outrageous immorality, unbridled ferocity, and complete lack of any moral restraints. It was said, for example, that he once at a feast ordered his freedmen to be beaten to death simply because he refused to drink more wine and get drunk at his command. Another time, driving a chariot on the Appian Way, he deliberately, out of pure sadism, ran over and killed a small child carelessly playing on the roadside. And once in the Roman Forum, during a public quarrel, he ordered his slaves to seize a noble Roman knight and gouged out his eyes merely because he dared to contradict him in something. Roman rumor attributes to this Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus such cynical words which he allegedly uttered when he was informed of the birth of his son Lucius, the future Nero. "From me and Agrippina nothing can be born but abomination and sorrow for all mankind." In these cruel and self-revealing words there is a huge share of bitter and terrible truth, regardless of whether they were actually spoken or are a later invention, reflecting the general opinion about Nero's parents. What can I say? The heredity of the future monster emperor was, to put it mildly, remarkable and extremely burdened. Many ancient authors wrote about Nero, his life, reign, and crimes, thanks to whose detailed, though not always objective, works we know so many details of his biography. Among them, first of all, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus should be mentioned, who at the beginning of the 2nd century of our era held the post of imperial secretary ab epistulis, in charge of correspondence. under Emperors Trajan and Hadrian. This position gave him access to state archives, letters, and other documents. His famous collection of biographies, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, from Julius Caesar to Domitian, contains a most detailed description of both the public and especially private lives of the emperors, abounding in piquant, scandalous, and often shocking details which, however, cannot always be verified. There was also another, much more serious and profound historian, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, a senator and consul whose annals, covering the period from Augustus's death to Nero's death, and histories describing events after Nero's death, the so-called Year of the Four Emperors and the reign of the Flavian dynasty, are considered the pinnacle of Roman historiography for their depth of psychological analysis, dramatic presentation, and brilliant literary style. Tacitus wrote somewhat later than Suetonius, about 50 to 70 years after Nero's death, and tried to be more objective and critical of his sources, although he did not hide his republican disapproval of imperial power as such and his dislike for tyrants like Tiberius or Nero. Finally, there was also Cassius Dio Cocceianus, a Greek-speaking Roman historian, senator, and twice consul, who lived and wrote already at the beginning of the 3rd century of our era. His monumental Roman history, in 80 books written in Greek, is also an important, though later, source of information about Nero, largely based on the works of his predecessors, but also containing some original data. Naturally, over the centuries separating these authors from Nero's reign, his figure and his era undoubtedly became overgrown with numerous legends, rumors, anecdotes, and malicious exaggerations, especially from his political opponents and subsequent imperial dynasties who sought to blacken his memory. Therefore, it is sometimes quite difficult for a modern historian to discern what in these ancient stories is irrefutable, documentarily confirmed truth, and what is merely artistic exaggeration, moralizing rhetoric, hostile propaganda, or simply gossip. And yet, by critically analyzing and comparing these diverse sources, we can try to form a more or less complete and balanced understanding of the personality and deeds of this controversial emperor. Nero, at least in the very first years of his reign, indeed, apparently, sincerely tried to be good, or at least to seem so, let's put it that way. And in world historical literature, the opinion, originating from Tacitus, that the first 5 years of his reign, the so-called Quinquennium Neronis, Nero's 5 years from 54 to 59 of our era, looked very worthy and even promising against the general background of preceding and subsequent events, is firmly established. At this time, he was still under the strong influence of his 2 chief advisors, Praetorian prefect Afranius Burrus and the philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca. They guided his policy towards moderation, justice, and respect for the Senate. During this period, Nero pursued a fairly balanced domestic policy, showed some mercy to political opponents, abolished some of the most odious taxes, and strove for popularity with both the people and the senatorial aristocracy. He actively and with pleasure engaged in patronage, generously supporting poets, musicians, and architects, and this noble passion, it must be said, he retained until the very last day of his life, spending enormous sums of money, both from the state, treasury, and from his personal, constantly growing estates, on supporting various types of art and organizing lavish spectacles. Generous distribution of money both to the plebs during festivals and games and to army veterans and to talented artists was characteristic of him throughout his reign, perhaps also because in this generous gesture there was much that was theatrical, ostentatious, calculated to gain popularity and create the image of a magnanimous ruler. In his public speeches, he often uttered beautiful, high-flown, peacemaking words, promising the Roman people a golden age of justice, prosperity, and peace. "I will return husbands to their wives and sons to their mothers," he declared pathetically in one of his first speeches, alluding to the cessation of political repressions, executions, and exiles that had been so characteristic of his predecessors' reigns. And to some extent, he even fulfilled these promises at first. Some political exiles were amnestied, and the number of trials for insulting majesty was reduced. In foreign policy, Nero also had some success. For example, his generals finally managed to make peace with the mighty Parthian Empire in the east, establishing a lasting and fairly long peace on this restless border. In particular, the complex and long-standing issue of control over Armenia was cunningly resolved, which became a kind of buffer state under Roman protectorate, but with a Parthian king on the throne. However, despite these positive moments, much in his life, in his behavior, in his words and deeds, was already then outright acting, posturing, playing to the public. In his actions, it was sometimes difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish true feeling from well-rehearsed pretense, sincere intention from cold calculation, or simply a desire to make an impression. Evidently, the oppressive atmosphere of constant fear in which he had lived since childhood. First, it was fear of his imperious and unpredictable mother, then fear of possible conspiracies by dissatisfied senators, fear of losing the absolute power, so hard-won and ultimately life itself. This atmosphere gradually but inexorably transformed him into a true villain. With each passing year, he became more suspicious, distrustful, cruel, and terrifying to those around him. After the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, which, as already mentioned, occurred in 59 of our era and became a kind of Rubicon in his moral decline, it was the turn of his young stepbrother, Britannicus. Nero openly feared and hated him, and this was humanly understandable, though it in no way justified his subsequent actions. Britannicus, as the natural son of the deified Emperor Claudius, had, in the eyes of many Romans, more legitimate and solid claims to the imperial throne than Nero himself, who had only been adopted by Claudius under Agrippina's powerful pressure. Therefore, as long as Britannicus lived, Nero could not feel completely safe, and he decided to eliminate this threat. The emperor once again resorted to the services of the already mentioned infamous poisoner Locusta, a specialist in potent poisons, whose services, according to rumors, his late mother Agrippina had widely used to eliminate her political opponents, and possibly Claudius himself. In Rome at that time, Locusta was, one might say, a semi-official court poisoner, a very well-known and, alas, sought-after figure in high aristocratic circles, where political assassinations using poison mixed into food or drink were not such a great rarity. The prepared poison concocted by Locusta, Nero, displaying his sadistic curiosity and desire for control, decided to first test personally on some animal. According to some accounts, it was a kid goat. According to others, a calf. The animal, to his great disappointment and anger, lived for another 5 whole days after ingesting the poison, writhing in agony. The emperor was very dissatisfied with such slowness and inefficiency of the poison. He personally flogged Locusta and threatened her with terrible tortures and execution if she did not immediately provide him with a faster-acting and more reliable remedy. The frightened Locusta then brought another, much stronger potion and said with complete confidence, "Well, this one will surely work instantly and leave no traces." This new poison was immediately tested on a piglet, which, after swallowing the poison, indeed died instantly. Satisfied with the result, Nero began to consider how to discreetly administer the poison to Britannicus during one of the official court feasts. The task was not easy, as at such feasts there was always a special slave taster, pregustator, who was obliged to taste all food and all drink before members of the imperial family and other important guests touched them. This was a standard precautionary measure against poisoning, and then the following diabolical trick was devised. During the feast, young Britannicus, sitting at the same table as Nero, was first served a completely harmless but very hot, literally palate-scalding drink, possibly diluted wine. The youth, naturally, took a sip and immediately complained that it was completely impossible to drink it due to the high temperature. And then, in front of everyone, as if out of concern for him, a little cold water was poured into his cup to cool it. But this water, brought by a trusted servant, was already poisoned with that very fast-acting poison from Locusta. The unsuspecting Britannicus drank from the cup and immediately fell dead, contorted in terrible death throes, foaming at the mouth. Nero, coolly observing this horrific scene, cynically and imperturbably remarked to those present, many of whom were horrified and bewildered, "Nothing, Strashno, pay no attention. It's just another fit of his epilepsy which he has suffered from since childhood. He will come to his senses and wake up now." Although he knew perfectly well that his stepbrother was already dead and would never wake up. What is surprising, and at the same time eerie in this tragic story, is that Nero, emperor of Rome, ruler of a vast civilized empire, not only ordered the poison himself and planned the murder, but also personally, with chilling composure, communicated, with professional poisoners controlling the entire process of preparing the crime. What a consummate monster, embodying the darkest and most repulsive aspects of human nature. But before passing final judgment, let us try, at least for a moment, to look at the broader historical and social context of that era. How, perhaps easily and almost imperceptibly to oneself, could one become a monster at that time in that specific environment of permissiveness, flattery, and constant fear that surrounded Roman emperors? Let us recall at least one characteristic episode related to Nero's mother. Agrippina the Younger, as is known, greatly disliked one of the most influential favorites of her late husband Claudius, a certain powerful freedman named Narcissus, who held the post of secretary ab epistulis in charge of the imperial chancellery under Claudius and was effectively his first minister. Narcissus openly competed with Agrippina for influence over the aging emperor and often hindered her ambitious plans. He, in essence, controlled all monetary receipts to the treasury and expenditures, and Agrippina, for her political intrigues, bribing supporters, and luxurious life, always catastrophically lacked money. When Claudius died and Nero came to power, Narcissus, as one of the most loyal and influential men of the former emperor, was immediately removed from all positions and effectively sent into honorable exile, where he soon fell ill. Narcissus, perfectly understanding what awaited him and trying to save his life and curry favor with the new all-powerful ruler Agrippina, hastily destroyed all of Claudius's personal correspondence and other documents compromising her, which could, for example, prove her involvement in her husband's death or her other numerous crimes. But this did not help him at all. Agrippina, not having forgiven him for their past rivalry, still sent a centurion with a detachment of soldiers to him, who either forced him to commit suicide or simply killed him. This is just one private, though very characteristic fact among many similar ones, but it speaks very eloquently of the level of lawlessness, arbitrariness, and complete permissiveness that reigned then in the highest echelons of power for those who possessed it. The Roman Empire, still only strengthening as a unified state in the process of complex formation of its new imperial institutions in place of a Respublikanskich that had outlived its usefulness, was experiencing very difficult and contradictory times during that period. There was a constant hidden and sometimes erupting into open conflicts struggle between imperial power and the Senate, which still tried to cling to the remnants of its former influence and prestige among a certain part of the senators, especially from the old aristocracy. An internal, dull opposition to the imperial regime secretly strengthened and matured. But at the same time, as often happens in authoritarian systems, crude flattery, sycophancy, and outright servility before the emperor and his favorites flourished with a lush, poisonous bloom. At the same time, the bright memory of the great Roman Republic, of its legendary freedoms, virtues, and heroes, had by no means completely disappeared from people's consciousness. It was secretly dreamed of, idealized, philosophers and poets wrote about it, although the Republic itself as a political system had long and irretrievably died, and society in such turning, critical moments of its history, as often happens, becomes like a hopelessly ill person, tossing in fever, losing moral bearings, and easily succumbing to the basest instincts. This deep sickness, this moral decay and erosion of traditional values like a contagious infection gradually permeated all strata of Roman society, from the highest to the lowest. Let us recall at least that mad, almost pathological passion of the broad Roman public, including women and children, for the cruelest gladiatorial combats, for bloody spectacles of animal baiting and public executions of criminals in the circus. Arena where human life and suffering were worth absolutely nothing and served only as vulgar entertainment for the crowd. This cult of cruelty and violence, manifested both in wartime and peacetime, is usually inherent precisely in periods of deep social and moral crises in society, when old ethical norms and values are rapidly collapsing, and new ones have not yet had time to form and take root. And all this undoubtedly cannot but have the most detrimental influence on whoever stands at the very helm of power, whose power is in fact not limited or restrained by any real legal or moral mechanisms. Furthermore, it must be emphasized once again that Nero's own nature, according to numerous testimonies, was extremely receptive, impressionable, artistically unstable, extremely unbalanced, and prone to sharp mood swings. He could instantly, for the most trivial reason, flare up in uncontrollable blind rage, during which he was capable of any cruelty. And then, a short time later, he could just as sincerely weep with emotion upon hearing the sad and gentle sounds of a harp, a touching poem, or seeing a beautiful landscape. He was by no means absolutely devoid of art. Moreover, he passionately loved it, and, what was most dangerous, sincerely considered himself a brilliant, unsurpassed artist in all fields. He sang, although his voice, according to contemporaries, was weak and muffled. He composed poems, which his court poets probably helped him write. He played the cithara and other musical instruments. He performed in tragic roles on stage. He even tried his hand at sculpture and painting. He constantly competed with other professional singers, poets, and citharists in various musical and poetic contests, and which is perfectly natural and unsurprising for an almighty emperor, always and everywhere won, receiving all prizes and wreaths. During his famous and scandalous artistic tour of Greece in 66 to 67 of our era, where he went specifically to participate in all major Pan-Hellenic musical, poetic, and athletic competitions, including the Olympic, Pythian, Nemean, and Isthmian Games, which were specially rescheduled for him, he, according to the calculations of his fawning courtiers, received no less than 1,808 golden wreaths of victory. True, ancient historians sarcastically note that he was inseparably accompanied everywhere by a huge detachment of about 5,000 young men, specially selected, well-trained, and generously paid, the so-called Augustans, who provided him with deafening, prearranged ovations and enthusiastic shouts at every public performance. We today, without any doubt, would call these people professional hired claqueurs. His morbidly vain and delicate artistic nature simply could not have survived any public failure, any criticism of his brilliant talent. Singing in public, triumphal artistic tours through the cities of Italy and Greece, deafening ovations from a specially prepared crowd, universal servile adoration of his supposed talents. This is what truly captivated him, what was genuinely interesting to him and brought him true pleasure. Real state affairs, the administration of a huge and complex empire, over time seemed to him increasingly boring, tiresome, and burdensome. He changed his closest advisors and associates with astonishing ease and cynicism, ruthlessly getting rid of those who became displeasing to him, seemed too influential, or simply bored him. Even Seneca, the great Stoic philosopher, his longtime wise teacher and faithful mentor, to whom he owed so much in the early years of his reign and whom he once perhaps even sincerely loved and deeply respected, Nero first gradually removed from all state affairs, and then, after the discovery of the large-scale conspiracy of Gaius Calpurnius Piso in 65, in which Seneca perhaps did not directly participate, but about which he might have known, effectively forced him to commit suicide by sending him the appropriate order. After this, Nero, according to Suetonius's accounts, allegedly regularly and impatiently inquired of his servants whether Seneca was still alive, whether he had finally committed suicide. And, upon finally hearing the news of his courageous suicide, Seneca slit his veins in accordance with Stoic traditions. According to legend, he hypocritically sighed, but in his heart probably calmed down, having rid himself of the silent reproach of his conscience. However, striving for objectivity, it must be said in fairness that Seneca himself, being a man of strictest moral principles, a representative of severe Stoic philosophy, and at the same time an experienced courtier, tried, especially in the early years, to mold from his young and impulsive crowned pupil a certain idealized image of a wise, just, and virtuous ruler, which was apparently completely contrary and alien to his real artistic, egocentric, and extremely unstable nature. Seneca, like Burrus, persistently, though tactfully, forbade him to get too carried away with unworthy of imperial rank pursuits, in particular public singing, playing the cithara, and performing on the theatrical stage in roles of actors or charioteers, considering this humiliating for a Roman emperor and harmful to his authority. Seneca, and in general, as we can judge, quite rightly, believed that Nero lacked sufficient natural talent and ability for serious professional engagement in art, but for his morbidly vain and spoiled by flattery youth, who sincerely considered himself a genius in everything, to admit this fact, obvious to many, was incredibly difficult and humiliating. Nero was also, at the insistence of his tutors, forbidden in his youth to read too much and too diligently, and even such a great epic poet as Homer, because his mentors believed that physical exercises, gymnastics in the fresh air, and military training were much more useful for the health and character formation of the future ruler of the Roman Empire. Seneca and Burrus's pupil indeed grew up to be a physically strong, rather robust, hardy, and agile young man, which greatly pleased his teacher Seneca, who himself had been fond of athletics in his youth. But in his spiritual life, in his inner world apparently, there was not enough room for a deep study of Virgil, for reflection on those complex philosophical, ethical, and civic questions that are raised, for example, in his immortal Aeneid or in Plato's dialogues. And these books perhaps could have somewhat changed his view of the world, of people, of his own destiny, could have ennobled his unstable and selfish nature, directed his enormous energy and ambition into a more constructive and positive channel. But no, Seneca, despite all his undoubted merits as a thinker and writer, as an educator, apparently tried too straightforwardly and authoritatively to break the natural character of his high-ranking pupil, forcing him to act only as he himself considered right and proper, and not otherwise, not always taking into account Nero's individual psychological characteristics, inclinations, and complexes. I think every true teacher and wise educator should always remember that the consequences of such harsh, authoritarian methods of upbringing, which do not take into account the unique personality of the student and try to forcibly squeeze it into preconceived frameworks, can be most deplorable and unpredictable. In this particular case, alas, they proved to be truly tragic, both for the student himself, who, freed from tutelage, threw off all masks and turned into a monstrous tyrant, and for his teacher, who in the end fell an innocent victim of his own ungrateful and degenerate pupil. The apogee of Nero's unbridled, almost maniacal love for art, or rather for grandiose theatrical effects, self-admiration, and reshaping the world according to his own whim, was the famous and tragic story of 64 of our era, the so-called Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed a large part of the city. Probably modern historians, despite all their efforts, will never be able to say with absolute 100% certainty whether Nero himself was directly or indirectly involved in the outbreak of this catastrophic event, or if it is just one of the numerous dark and malicious legends that densely surround his sinister name. According to the most widespread, rather mythological and propagandistic than strictly historical version actively spread by his enemies, he himself secretly ordered his agents to set fire to Rome in several places simultaneously. Allegedly, he did this so that the majestic and terrifying sight of the gigantic burning city would inspire him to write a new epic poem about the capture and fire of ancient Troy, with which he loved to compare himself and his deeds. It was even said that he, during the height of the fire, when thousands of people were dying and entire neighborhoods were collapsing, calmly stood on a high tower of his palace, or, according to another version, on the tower of the palace of his late friend Gaius Maecenas, the famous patron of arts and friend of Octavian Augustus, and, looking detachedly at the raging sea of fire below, recited verses about the fall of Troy, accompanying himself on the cithara or lyre. This vivid, picturesque, and extremely incriminating story most likely indeed belongs to the realm of later mythology and anti-Neronian propaganda, although it perhaps well reflects some features of Nero's eccentric, narcissistic, and artistic nature. Judging by more reliable and less biased historical sources, such as, for example, Tacitus's Annals, Nero was unlikely to have been in Rome itself at the time of the outbreak of this gigantic fire. He was apparently at that time at his luxurious country villa in Antium, on the coast of the Tyrrhenian Sea, about 50 kilometers from the capital. Upon learning of the terrible disaster, he, according to Tacitus, immediately hurried back to Rome and even took some energetic and quite adequate measures to combat the fire, to save people, and to provide assistance to the numerous victims. He opened his gardens and public buildings for the homeless, organized food delivery, and lowered grain prices. Ancient cities like Rome, which were built predominantly of easily flammable materials such as wood, and had extremely dense, chaotic development with narrow, crooked streets, burned very often. It was a practically inevitable disaster. A single accidental careless spark from a hearth, an overturned oil lamp, or deliberate arson in one of the densely populated poor quarters was enough for an uncontrolled fire to start. There is also another, more plausible and less sensational version of events, according to which Nero perhaps did not give a direct order to set fire to the city, but when the fire had already started due to accidental causes, he might have given a tacit command to the fire brigades, vigils, not to be too diligent in extinguishing some old, densely populated, slum-like, and extremely unsanitary quarters of Rome, built up with dilapidated multi-story wooden insulae. He might have done this so that later, after the fire had cleared these territories, new, more modern, spacious, and majestic stone buildings could be erected in their place, wide, straight streets could be laid, and most importantly, his new, grandiose imperial palace, the so-called Golden House, Domus Aurea, could be built, which in its size and luxury was to surpass everything built before it. This assumption, given his known gigantic ambitions in urban planning and passion for monumental architecture, looks very possible and quite plausible. When the fire, which raged for no less than 6 days and 7 nights and destroyed or damaged 10 of Rome's 14 districts, finally subsided, and it was urgently necessary to find some culprits to appease the enraged, desperate population, deprived of homes and property, who began to openly grumble and accuse the emperor himself of arson. Nero, on the advice of his most odious associates, such as Praetorian Prefect Tigellinus, decided to place all responsibility for this terrible incident on members of the Christian community. Christians at that time were still a relatively unknown, small, and not very popular religious sect in the broad strata of Roman society, which had broken away from Judaism and aroused suspicion among the authorities for its reclusive lifestyle, refusal to participate in pagan cults, and veneration of the emperor. Nero staged a most cruel, exemplary massacre, numerous, sophisticatedly torturous, and theatricalized mass executions of the so-called arsonists. Christians, men, women, and even children were seized by the hundreds, thrown to wild, hungry beasts in the circus arena, crucified along roads, and some, as Tacitus describes with grim satisfaction, were smeared with flammable resin and sulfur, tied to stakes, and burned alive, using them as terrible living torches to illuminate his nocturnal orgies and garden festivities. This was the first major targeted and officially sanctioned wave of cruel persecutions against Christians in Roman history, which marked the beginning of the long and tragic history of Christian martyrdom. In the last years of Emperor Nero's life and reign, his unbridled acting, his almost pathological passion for public performances, self-admiration, and deification of his own person took on increasingly morbid, grotesque, and provocative forms. Apparently thanks to the tireless, well-paid efforts of those very 5,000 professional hired claqueurs from among the Augustans and many thousands of courtly and senatorial flatterers, thanks to that atmosphere of universal deceit, hypocrisy, and sycophancy that densely surrounded him, Nero in the end finally and irrevocably came to believe that he was indeed the greatest, most brilliant and unsurpassed actor, singer, poet, musician, and charioteer of all times and peoples. He even issued special imperial edicts strictly forbidding spectators not only to express disapproval, but even simply to move, cough, talk, or leave the theater during his endless, hours-long solo performances. To leave the theater, even in case of the most extreme physical necessity, was completely impossible. It was immediately regarded as the most heinous crime. Insulting imperial majesty, crimen laesae majestatis, and was punishable by exile or even death. Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, mention completely shocking and almost anecdotal cases where some women, unable to endure sitting for many hours in a stuffy theater, gave birth right in their seats during his interminable performances, not daring to get up and leave. It is also said that the future emperor Titus Flavius Vespasian, then not yet very famous but an experienced and respected provincial military commander in the army, whom Nero for some reason took with him in his retinue during an artistic tour of Greece, once deathly tired, carelessly fell asleep and even, according to rumors, snored loudly during another prolonged performance by the divine emperor Tyrant. It would seem that Vespasian's life after such unheard-of sacrilege should have inevitably ended. But Nero on that day, fortunately for Vespasian and for the future Roman Empire, was in an unusually good, benign mood and merely waved his hand contemptuously, saying something like, "Well, what can this uncouth country bumpkin understand about truly high art?" And the offending Vespasian was simply disgracefully dismissed from court and exiled to his native village in Italy, of course, not even suspecting at that moment that this coarse but practical and sensible man from the common people, a military commander hardened in numerous battles and campaigns, would quite soon, after Nero's own death in a bloody civil war, become the new emperor, founder of a new dynasty of Rome, and bring the empire long-awaited peace and stability. Nero's love affairs and marriages also represent something chaotic, unnatural, sometimes grotesque, and almost always terrible in their tragic consequences for those women who had the misfortune to become the object of his fickle passion or political calculation. He, as already mentioned, was forcibly, for political reasons, married at a very young 16-year-old age to his stepsister Claudia Octavia, daughter of Emperor Claudius by his third wife Messalina, and consequently full sister of the unfortunate Britannicus. This was another cunning combination and scheme of his imperious mother Agrippina, who thereby sought to further strengthen her son's dynastic rights to the throne and to connect him by marriage with Claudius's direct descendants. But towards his young, innocent wife, still a girl, distinguished by a gentle disposition, nobility, and traditional Roman virtue, Nero from the very beginning felt complete physical revulsion, coldness, and even unconcealed dislike. In the end, he began to avoid her in every way, openly neglected her, took numerous mistresses, and this formal, dynastic marriage became a source of truly deep unhappiness and humiliation for both spouses, especially for the unfortunate Octavia. Then he fell passionately, though not for long, in love with a beautiful freedwoman named Claudia Acte, originally apparently from Asia Minor. And by all appearances, she loved him sincerely and selflessly, remaining loyal to him even after he abandoned her for a new passion. This perhaps was one of the rare, if not the only, relatively happy and harmonious episodes in his turbulent and disorderly personal life, until the very end of his tragic and shameful life. Claudia Acte, as they say, retained warm feelings for him, and then when everyone had abandoned and cursed him, it was she, along with his two old nurses, Ecloga and Alexandria, who took care of a dignified burial of his remains. However, the loyalty and love of the devoted Act by no means prevented the fickle Nero from soon cheating on her and seeking ever new love affairs and thrills. Thus, he fell madly, almost maniacally, in love with one of Rome's foremost beauties, the noble, ambitious, and extremely calculating matron Poppaea Sabina, who at that time was married to one of his close friends and drinking companions, the young aristocrat Marcus Salvius Otho, the future short-lived emperor in the year of the four emperors. Because of his all-consuming passion for Poppaea, who skillfully manipulated him, he first cunningly removed his friend-rival Otho from court, appointing him governor of the distant and not very prestigious province of Lusitania, modern Portugal. And then, under constant pressure from the ambitious Poppaea, who dreamed of becoming empress and bearing an heir to the throne, he finally decided to divorce his long-disliked but still popular among the people wife Octavia. For this, false accusations of adultery and, what was more important for dynastic plans, of infertility were fabricated against her. The unfortunate Octavia was first exiled to the deserted island of Pandataria in the Tyrrhenian Sea, and then a short time later by Nero's secret order, and probably at Poppaea's insistence, she was cruelly murdered there by having her veins opened and being suffocated in a hot bath. Just 12 days after the official divorce from Octavia, Nero's lavish and solemn wedding with Poppaea Sabina took place, who became the new empress. However, even this seemingly passionately desired marriage did not bring Nero longed-for happiness and peace of mind. A few years later, in 65, during a family quarrel, Nero, in a state of affect and possibly drunk, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, brutally beat his wife Poppaea, who at that moment was pregnant with their second child, and kicked her hard in the stomach, from which she soon died of internal bleeding or premature birth. The picture that emerges from these facts is truly terrible and chilling. Young stepbrother Britannicus, coolly poisoned, hired assassins sent to his own mother Agrippina by her son's order. One innocent wife, Octavia, ruthlessly murdered. Then, in a fit of rage, another, Poppaea. And this is without even counting the many other, less notorious but no less cruel and cynical murders, which were not so important and noticeable in his turbulent and bloody life, but which cost the lives of many. Noble senators, talented military commanders, philosophers, poets, and simply honest and decent people who had the misfortune to arouse his suspicion, anger, or envy. Of course, nature, genetics, probably in one way or another, participate in the birth of such moral monsters. Heredity, as we have already seen in the grim example of his father Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, and his imperious cruel mother Agrippina, played here perhaps far from the last and not the best role. But the matter, of course, is not only and not so much in it. The time itself, the era itself, as we have already noted, was terrible, cruel, and cynical. The personality of a particular person, especially if it is initially unstable, vicious, and devoid of firm moral principles, suddenly finding itself at the pinnacle of unlimited absolute power, inevitably falls into a suffocating atmosphere of universal cruelty, moral brokenness, political intrigues, suspicion, flattery, and the deepest perversion of morals. Nero's reign was not just an episode of the rule of one mad tyrant. It was perhaps one of the vivid symptoms and at the same time a catalyst for the beginning of a deep and prolonged spiritual and moral decline of the great Roman civilization, although several long and turbulent centuries still remained until its final military-political fall in the West. By the 1st century of our era, Roman society and state had behind them almost 1,000 years of continuous, though not always smooth, ascent conquests, and cultural and legal development. This long and generally astonishingly successful development, which transformed the modest and small Italic city-state of Rome into the ruler of practically the entire then civilized Mediterranean world, could not but create in the consciousness of the ruling elite a special imperial ideology of permissiveness, superiority over other peoples, and conviction in its own exclusivity. For victors, as is known, are not judged, and the gods clearly favor Rome. And when, after the establishment of the empire, the old centuries-proven republican institutions, Senate, popular assembly, magistracies, of which the Roman Republic and its civic community were once so proud, began to gradually break down, degenerate, and lose their significance. When the last embers of real political opposition died out after the bloody rivers of the era of Sulla's proscriptions and the devastating civil wars of the 1st century BCE, then this terrible, ugly phenomenon of demonstrative, almost theatrical amorality, cynicism, and contempt for any laws and norms was born in the very highest echelons of society. And this deeply rooted amorality, this atmosphere of moral decay and spiritual emptiness of the old aristocratic foundations became, to use a figurative expression, that very sinister midwife who was present at the birth and formation of such a Nero, as he forever entered world history as a symbol of mad tyranny and moral decay. Nero's death, which occurred in June of 68 of our era, like his entire preceding life, fits very accurately and symbolically into this whole grim and tragic picture. He was in power for a total of almost 14 years, not so little by the standards of the turbulent and unpredictable lives of Roman emperors of that era, many of whom ruled for much less. As we recall, his reign in the very first 5 years, under the guidance of Seneca and Burrus, was quite decent, moderate, and even in many ways promising. What a terrible and rapid evolution, or rather, degradation, did he undergo in the following years. He increasingly indulged in acting, sank deeper and more irretrievably into the world of his delusional artistic fantasies, megalomania, and morbid illusions, and at the same time, he increasingly forgot about the real needs and problems of the state, about the burdens of daily administration of a huge and complex world empire. As a result, in the last years of his reign, he practically completely lost interest in what was happening in Rome and in the numerous, often restless provinces, delegating all state affairs to his inept and corrupt favorites and flatterers, such as the Praetorian prefect Gaius Aphonius Tigellinus. Naturally, in the capital of the empire, in Rome, among senators and even among the people, a dull but increasingly strong dissatisfaction with his mad rule, his boundless extravagance, his unpredictable cruelty, his contempt for Roman traditions and state affairs gradually matured and accumulated. Soon, this dissatisfaction erupted into open armed rebellion in the provinces. The first to rebel in March of 68 was the governor of Lugdunensian Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex, who called for the overthrow of the tyrant. Although his rebellion was suppressed by troops loyal to Nero from Germany, it served as a signal for others. To suppress the major Jewish revolt that began simultaneously in Palestine, Nero had earlier sent his best and most experienced general, Vespasian. Following Gaul, Tarraconensian Spain also rebelled, and the leader of the disaffected, there was also a Roman, the elderly but respected senator Servius Sulpicius Galba, who was proclaimed emperor by his legions. Galba was also supported by other governors and armies. And finally, the decisive, fatal blow to Nero was dealt by his own support, the imperial guard, the Praetorians, quartered in Rome. Bribed by Galba's agents and dissatisfied with Nero, they refused to obey him and went over to the side of the rebellious Galba, declaring him the new emperor. It was then that Nero, who until the last moment had not believed in the seriousness of what was happening and continued his artistic amusements, finally, with horror, came to his senses and suddenly, as if a veil had fallen from his eyes, saw clearly, realizing the full depth of his catastrophic fall, his complete loneliness, and his inevitable demise. He, according to Suetonius's account, woke up late one night in his luxurious golden house, and the palace was completely empty. There was no one from his recently numerous retinue, devoted servants, bodyguards, only a dead, sepulchral, ringing silence. All his personal guard, all courtiers, all slaves, sensing trouble had fled, abandoning him to his fate. In a panic like a hunted animal, he rushed through the huge, empty, and echoing halls of his palace, desperately calling out to his servants by name, but no one answered his call. Finally, he stumbled upon one of the few freedmen who remained loyal to him, named Phaon, who took pity on his former master and said to him, "Come quickly to my country villa. It is not far from Rome, between the Salarian and Nomentan roads. I will hide you there for a time from the Senate and the soldiers." Phaon wrapped the face of Nero, trembling with fear, in an old dark cloak so that he would not be recognized in the streets, and, together with 3 or 4 other loyal companions, led him out of the palace and brought him to his modest country house. There, Phaon and the few other people who remained loyal to Nero, seeing his complete confusion and despair, immediately began to persistently urge him, "Master, there is no other way out. Come on, gather your courage and kill yourself as befits a Roman of your high rank and origin before they capture you, because soldiers from the Senate have surely already been sent after you, and if they find you, only public disgrace, agonizing tortures, and a humiliating execution await you." By that time, the Roman Senate, which throughout Nero's reign had trembled before him and servilely fulfilled all his whims, now, emboldened after his flight and the praetorians' defection to Galba's side, immediately declared Nero hostis publicus, enemy of the fatherland, that is, an outlaw, and decided to apply to him the traditional ancient Roman execution, intended for particularly dangerous state criminals and traitors, the so-called execution, according to ancestral custom, mor majorum. Nero, hearing this from Phaon, asked in horror and with a trembling voice, "And what is that? What kind of execution is that?" He gloomily and reluctantly explained to him, "Your neck will be clamped in a special wooden fork or stock so that you cannot move and will be on your knees, and your naked body will be mercilessly beaten, flogged, and scourged with rods or whips until you die of pain and blood loss." Hearing this terrible description, Nero began to wail, burst into tears of fear, despair, and self-pity. But still, even in this his last, most tragic and humiliating moment, he remained above all an artist, a poseur, a man most concerned with the impression he would make on posterity. Several times he took a dagger in his hands, brought it to his throat or chest, but never dared to strike the fatal blow, complaining of his cowardice and urging one of those present to set him an example. He ordered his companions to dig him a grave in the courtyard the size of his body, and looking at its miserable dimensions, again lamented that, alas, such a great and unique talent, such an artist, was perishing so ingloriously. And finally, only when he heard the approaching clatter of horses' hooves, these were the horsemen sent by the Senate for his arrest, he, with the help of his loyal secretary Epaphroditus, who helped guide his hand, with difficulty plunged a dagger into his throat, managing to exclaim before death his famous, now winged last words, "Qualis artifex pareo," which can be translated as "What a great artist dies in me," or "What an artist the world is losing." But Nero, however paradoxical and strange it may seem, also had a kind of long and mysterious life after death. Instantly after his demise, a persistent and tenacious rumor spread throughout the vast Roman Empire, especially in its eastern Greek-speaking provinces, where he was more popular due to his love for Greek culture, that he had not actually died, but had somehow miraculously managed to escape and fled to the east, to his former enemies, the Parthians, or even further, to unknown lands, and that he supposedly would soon return at the head of a huge army to take cruel revenge on his numerous enemies in Rome, punish the ungrateful Senate, and reclaim his legitimate imperial throne. This intriguing rumor, known in history as the legend of Nero redivivus, that is, Nero reborn or Nero returned, persisted among the people for a very long time, for several decades after his death, and from time to time impostors even appeared posing as the miraculously saved Nero and trying to stir up rebellions. Mainly, this legend was so tenacious because many in Rome and in the provinces knew well. Nero in his lifetime had several so-called doubles, people strikingly similar to him physically, whom he, according to rumors, sometimes used for some secret or not very important public appearances, or simply to confuse and mislead his potential conspirators and assassins. Therefore, for many, it was quite natural to assume that in Phaon's country villa, one of these unknown doubles had actually died, while the real Nero himself was alive, well, and would yet show himself to the world. For many years after his death, on his rather modest, though decently arranged tomb, which his loyal former mistress Claudia Acte and his two old nurses, Ecloga and Alexandria, had built for him, some unknown and mysterious admirers of his memory mysteriously regularly left fresh spring flowers, especially violets, and this, of course, only further strengthened among the people and, in certain circles, the assumptions about his miraculous salvation and impending return. Fortunately for Rome, for his successors on the throne, and for all subsequent generations, these alarming assumptions and hopes of his supporters turned out to be just a beautiful but unfounded myth. But the very fact of such a long and persistent existence of such a myth about a tyrant's return says a lot. Fear, like for that matter, desperate hope for a miracle, often gives birth to the most incredible and tenacious myths, which sometimes turn out to be much more durable and influential than dull and prosaic historical reality itself. Such was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the fifth emperor of Rome, a man in whom the refined aesthete and the bloody tyrant, the generous patron and the ruthless murderer, the ambitious artist and the inept ruler were bizarrely and tragically combined. His 14-year reign, which began so promisingly and ended so shamefully, became one of the most controversial, dramatic, and undoubtedly dark periods in the long and glorious history of ancient Rome. But it also left behind many unresolved questions and enigmas over which historians, writers, and philosophers continue to reflect and argue to this day. Was he initially from birth doomed to become the monster he entered history as due to his bad heredity, vicious upbringing, and the pernicious influence of a corrupt environment? Or was it unlimited, absolute power, unrestrained by any laws or moral norms, combined with an atmosphere of universal fear, obsequious flattery, and cynicism that gradually and inexorably corrupted his, initially perhaps not entirely hopeless, soul? Perhaps as often happens in complex historical questions, there is no unequivocal answer here, and the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle in a complex interweaving of all these factors. But one thing remains undisputed even today. The sinister figure of Nero, his life and his death, serve as an eternal and formidable reminder to humanity of how destructive, all-consuming, and self-destructive unbridled tyranny can be, and how fragile, vulnerable, and malleable human nature can be in the face of the temptation of absolute power. Thank you for your attention, and until new, I hope, no less interesting encounters on the fascinating and instructive pages of world history.